The House committee investigating the January 6, 2021 attack on the US Capitol has begun a series of public hearings. The third of those hearings is scheduled to take place tomorrow, June 16. In the sessions so far, the committee has showcased previously unreleased footage of the January 6 attack and testimony from White House officials. What to make of this investigation? What are some important takeaways so far? And what do these hearings tell us about our culture? Welcome to New Ideal Live, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. Today, we're taking a close look at the philosophic meaning of the January 6 attack, the hearings, and the reactions to both. I'm Elan Journo. With me today is Onkar Ghate. Welcome, Onkar.
Hi, Elan.
I thought it'd be useful to start by just taking a moment to reset the context. So we did a 2.5 hour plus podcast about January 6th, just around the time after it happened. And I thought we should just set the context for people who haven't had a chance to watch that and give them a sense of how we viewed it at the time. So I want to turn to you. In the time since the attack, people have come back and said, this was a hoax, it was overblown, it was a political protest that got out of hand. How significant do you think it was culturally, politically, philosophically?
What we talked about in the podcast, and I went back and watched the whole thing to refresh my memory about, I can remember some of it, but not everything that we said. We talked about it as the way to classify it is as a terrorist attack. It's domestic terrorism, but it's still terrorism. It's the use of violence to achieve political goals. I don't think it's right to think of it as a coup or an insurrection in the sense that these were individuals who are going to seize the power of the federal government and going to put themselves, now we're in charge of the federal government. That's not the right way to think about it. But what they were trying to achieve is a political goal by using violence. They were trying to terrify the representatives in Congress to change the vote. I mean, a lot was directed towards Mike Pence, and that was Trump too. If he does the right thing, if he has the courage to do the right thing, this is part of what Trump was telling his supporters. And to see this attack on the Capitol and the breach of the Capitol as an attempt to intimidate and terrorize Mike Pence, but not only Mike Pence, to change what their vote or their actions as government representatives. And here in the most important institution in the government, the Congress, the body that makes and passes laws. So I think that is the right way to think of what January 6th was. It was a domestic terrorism and directed at one of the most important government institutions on a very important issue, which is the peaceful transition of power, the election of a president, and him coming into office and his predecessor leaving office. So it's a very significant, it certainly warrants investigation into what happened and how to prevent any such thing in the future.
Yeah, one other point I would add to your comments is that this is coming on the heels of a year, 2020, where the United States saw a lot of rioting and significant unrest. So if you think about Portland or Seattle, where there were zones where the police just withdrew, so there was really no law enforcement in certain places, and we saw cities burn. Now, this is not the same people carrying out these attacks, but one of the things that 2020 one of the watershed outcomes of 2020 and all of that sort of street violence was that it made this kind of behavior, this political violence, it took a step towards normalizing that as something that just people come to expect. Oh, this side is doing it in Portland and Seattle, and this is what happens in these cities. Oh, okay, well, what's the big deal about doing it at the Capitol? So there's a sense in which it sort of numbs people to the significance of it, and that this is a significant violation of the rule of law. I mean, that's an understatement, and we'll talk more about that. But I think that's if there's any kind of legacy from January 6th, it's pushing us more towards that contempt for the rule of law than we were ever in that position, I think, in recent years.
Yeah, contempt
So,
for it, and the substitution of force for law, and then like explicit substitution of force. The fact that we can intimidate you is what should determine what happens.
so I agree with you. I think it's both appropriate and necessary to investigate the January 6th attack. And but so having said that, I had a strange reaction to the first two hearings. I watched them both. I heard the first one on the radio initially, but I caught up watching them both. A couple of things struck me, and I just want to put this on the table, is that there was something. So as sympathetic as I am with the goal of investigating this and bringing to light what actually happened and bringing people to justice, this was very highly produced. There was, I think that this people complained that the committee brought in an expert, a television producer who helped them manage this. It's very choreographed, highly scripted. And another way to look at that is it's very effective communication. So the first one was done on prime time. So that I thought was, I mean, I can live with some of that, but there's definitely aspects of this that I think are either valid or plausible criticisms of the hearing. So let's talk about that. So what do you think are some of those things to be concerned about with the hearings?
Yeah, I too had a reaction to how produced this is, and is this compatible with a investigation that's trying to just lay out the facts? This is what we've learned. This is how it happened, why it happened, and then having some future orientation of that. This is what we need to do so that this does not happen again. It's similar. We were talking a little bit before we went live about the hearing or commission looking into 9/11. That had a lot of flaws, but the basic thing of that there's some investigation of how did this happen, why did it happen, and how do we prevent something like 9/11 from happening again. That's valid for a government to be investigating and to be thinking about. When it's so highly produced, yeah, I had the same kind of mixed reaction. On the one hand, in our current 21st century world where people are much more visual, they read less. If you just issue a report, like who's going to look at it? So the fact that it's presented in a way that is more, that you could think of as more digestible, I could see an argument for that. I don't think that's what we're quite getting here. So there's elements that that's not the only reason they're having this so public on camera. So, there's, I think there is an element of this is political. It's for a political purpose. And we can talk some about that. I even had the reaction, like, is this a hearing? It's some people who dismiss it, but I don't think this is, you have to think about this, but it's not grounds to dismiss everything. Have characterized it like this looks like another impeachment trial. And that, particularly for the first, so we've had two of these sessions. The first one, I thought it has that atmosphere. This is now, like, here's a third impeachment of Trump. And is that exactly what the commission or this committee should be doing? I don't think so. And then there's the issue of this is not a bipartisan committee. And that's worth thinking about as well. And that the McCarthy, as the majority leader in Congress, appointed or like recommended 5 Republicans to this committee, and Pelosi turned down 2. And it's not obvious that she had ground. I could see some grounds. We could talk about that for why she might dismiss some people who were nominated. But for the people she dismissed, I did not think good grounds were given for it.
Well, let's dig into that a bit. So one thought I was reflecting on is, what would it take for this kind of investigation to be objective? And my thought is that having a bipartisan panel it's not inherently objective. It doesn't, I mean, you could have a whole bunch of people who are just not going to behave well, whatever configuration is. So I don't think that's the hallmark of objectivity. But let's talk about it. Why would there be a good reason to make it bipartisan, if any? And what do you think are the reasons given for not taking some of the the Republicans who were put forward?
Yeah, I think widely, and this is what you're bringing up in terms of it doesn't guarantee objectivity, but the reason you would want some of the Republicans on, and even some people skeptical of some of the claims that have been made and were in the news and the news reporting of it, is that when you think, so part of what they've presented in these two things is excerpts from interviews and questioning of various people, some lawyers, some generals, and so like a cross section of people who had some connection or involvement. That doesn't mean to say they were responsible for the attack. They might have been trying to prevent them, or so, but they had involvement of the lead up and aftermath of January 6th. And one of the reasons to have people who are not all on the same side politically is it's easy that you ask a few questions. They might even be like a little bit leading questions to this, and you hear what you want to hear, and then you just stop and you don't ask any more probing, difficult questions. See if their story holds up, or are there inconsistencies if you push a little bit. And you want that, like, if this is a real, supposed to be fact finding about what happened, and part of the facts are interviewing people and getting their testimonies, you want that to happen. And if it's not impossible for all the Democrats to do that, to ask difficult questions, challenging questions that don't come from sort of the direction in which they're already leaning, which I think is clearly that Trump should be impeached. I mean, given the two impeachment hearings. So, and that, like, yeah, I think that's right. That you want that. The Democrats could do it, but I'm skeptical that they did do it. So it would have been better, I think, to have Republicans who actually were taking this seriously, but nevertheless asking challenging questions that the Democrats probably didn't ask of the witnesses.
This is probably something we should talk about later in the conversation, but it does occur to me that if there are Republicans who are skeptical and would really be interested in the facts, they're likely putting themselves in a difficult position by taking part in a panel like this, in an investigation, because of the outside role that Donald Trump still has in the Republican Party, and that, as we've seen in the recent elections, people are looking for his endorsement. If you don't have his endorsement, you're in trouble, and someone might primary you and things like that. So there's a worry that the better people who might come forward, or whose names might be put forward, won't do this because they're worried about the consequences, which is itself, we should come back to that. But I think that's definitely a dynamic that I would not be surprised if it's operating in the background.
Yeah, I think that's right. So McCarthy nominated 5 Republicans to serve on the committee, and Pelosi said, I would accept 3 of these. I'm not accepting 2 of them. And I could see grounds for not accepting some people nominated. Here's at least 2. That one, you're thinking of the person as part of the subject of the investigation. So part of what they're investigating is, like, what were the communications with the White House before and during January 6th? And there were people in the House calling and so on. And if that's what you're investigating, and they nominated someone who's the subject of the investigation, I could imagine, but both Democrat or Republican, if you think, no, but what we're looking into what they did, we can't have them on the committee looking into what they did. So that would be valid grounds, but from what I saw, that's not grounds given for it. It was, I think, Jim Banks and Jim Jordan were the 2 that were nominated, and Pelosi said, no, I won't take these. But it wasn't on grounds like that. And I could see if they nominated someone who will just be obstructionist from start to finish. So there's a difference between asking witnesses challenging questions and so on, and trying to just prevent the committee from doing what it's mandated to do. And if you thought someone like that has been nominated, to object to that. But I did not see good grounds given for why Pelosi was only accepting 3 of the 5 Republicans. And the result is that there's Liz Cheney on the committee, but there's not the people nominated by McCarthy. And that, I think, rightly makes people more suspicious of the committee's work.
So with that said, and the other thing we were talking about before we went live is the timing of the report. So the report is supposed to be, so the hearings are what we found out so far, and the report will be written and published sometime in the fall, I think, or close to the fall. September is the date I've heard thrown around. And that, I think, raises the other kind of concern that is it just going to take that much time to put it together? And that's, that's reasonable if it is going to take that much time. Or is it being timed to release in such a way that there's some political advantage for the elections, midterm elections too? So having said all that, do you think that what you've heard and what's being put forward, is there still enough objectivity, or is there still something here to pay attention to, and sort of with qualifications in terms of what you've said so far?
Yeah, I think so. I'm interested in what your reaction to the first 2 days has been. My view is you have to look at it with all these caveats in mind, that it's not bipartisan, it's not really a hearing, and I do think there's some political motivation and sort of grandstanding about this, that it is, I mean, the view, I think rightly, is that the Democrats are going to do very badly in the midterm elections, and that this might be something that helps them not do quite as badly. But on the other hand, as we started off with, this is a serious issue, very serious issue. And we are, I think, learning certain things about what happened. It's important to pay attention to that. And then I also think just we're now some distance away from it. So we did, we were talking about before, we did a podcast, a week or something after, I forget exactly when it was, of January 6th, and it's still raw. Stuff is coming out. You're still learning. This is an important thing to reflect back on and to try to see the total. And part of, I think, what we're getting from what they're presenting is it's not always effective, but trying to see it as a total. And that's important. Like, this is an important event of what happened in the country to think about. If you want to liken it to something, this, for younger viewers, this might not resonate too much, but like the OJ trial, there are all kinds of problems with the OJ trial, including, I think, how the prosecution proceeded, how they presented things, the most infamous thing, that they allowed OJ to try on the gloves and, oh, look, it doesn't fit. There's all kinds of bad things. But you can't dismiss the whole trial as though you didn't learn anything. And indeed, I think if you watch it, it's the evidence is overwhelming that O.J. Simpson is the murderer, and he got off of the. And so you can be critical of the trial, of the prosecution, and so on. And yet, I think it's just wrong to dismiss then the whole thing, that there's nothing here to see, nothing to learn. Let's move on. That's a mistake in regard to that, and I think it would be the same mistake in regard to this hearing.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I'm just to give a comparison. So I watched all of the hearing or testimony, I guess, that Frances Haugen did a few months back. So she was the whistleblower from Facebook who brought out all this information about how Facebook knows that it's harmful to teens and Instagram is a problem. And there is a marked difference between these two. Now, obviously, different purposes, different subject matter, but the feel you get from the listening to the Haugen questioning and her, not only her presentation, but just the questions she got from the lawmakers, they were throwing her softball questions, and I agree with everything you're saying. Now tell me more about what I want to hear. And it's just ridiculous in its flagrant non-objectivity. It's like, we all agree that everything you've said is completely unimpeachable. There's no question about any of the data you're showing us. It's data. Let's all sort of stand in awe of this, as if you can look at a slide from a slide presentation from some company and know the whole context of what actually was said in the meeting and what the people presented it meant. And it was just so obviously tendentious. And if you take that as a really low point in recent practice of how information is being sought, I think this, with all the criticisms and all the concerns there are with this hearing, these public hearings, they do come across a little bit more as we're interested in the truth and we've interviewed actual people and here's some clips from them. So, and I know that we might not get the full picture, but there's definitely less of that perspective that we already know what conclusion we want to get to. Now let's fit the puzzle pieces in to make it seem plausible. I take seriously that they interviewed people at length and you get some of the clips from that. So I'm much more open to hearing the rest of it. I don't have the sense that I'm being played the way I did with, for example, the Haugen hearing, which was completely ridiculous. And as you said, I think this is a real issue. There's no question this needs to be a focus of government activity and reflection. I think beyond the government too. I think it's an important issue for everyone to reflect on. So with that in mind, let's talk a bit about what from the first two hearings, what are some observations you took away? I have some, but why don't we start with you?
One, and going back to something you raised near the start of when we started talking, of people dismissing this as this wasn't a very significant event. I've heard people in effect put it like, yeah, okay, they went into the Capitol, they weren't supposed to be there, but they're sort of walking around taking pictures. And there is some footage of some people doing something like that who seem like they're tourists who are trespassing, that you're not supposed to be a tourist right now, Congress is in session and so on. But the idea that that is what happened, that's the essential characterization of the event, is crazy. And part of what has come out, and this is part of putting it as having a kind of view of a total here, is when you see some of the footage, some of which wasn't seen before, when you hear the experiences of some of the Capitol police and so on, nobody could think that what this was, yeah, some people trespassing and taking photos. And so, this was a real attack. The police experienced it like that. They were overwhelmed by it. I think one of the officers they were interviewing, and even there, I think who they chose is probably because they're camera friendly and so on. So there's an illegitimate aspect likely to that. But nevertheless, so you can think that and still think, okay, but this is representative of a number of the Capitol Police. This was what their experience was like. And she put it something like it was a war zone, and that's what it was experienced as. And I think the footage, it backs that up. It's not everybody there was fighting the police, but this was a massive attack. And if you're watching these or listening or watching to the hearings, I don't think you can honestly come away with thinking what it was just some tourist trespassing.
Yeah, and I think that it's really worth underscoring that point you made, that you can find people who were wandering around clueless and maybe they didn't even plan to be part of this. Maybe they got sort of swept along with this crowd and they didn't know that this was how it's going to play out. And there are scenes, and this is something that has come up in some of the critics, that they'll show one video clip of doors which were left open or allowed to be, and some of the attackers walk through the doors, and so the narrative you get is, well, they were let in. And that is a classic example of clipping video out of context in order to mislead people. And when you see the footage that hasn't been released and some of the footage that has been released, which I rewatched in preparation for today, it is really frightening. I mean, I was sitting and it was sort of reliving what I remember from 2021, watching it as the news was dripping out from various clips. The scene to think. So I think it's the key point I wanted to get across is that it doesn't have to be true that every single person who breached into the Capitol had a premeditated goal and this is what they were going to do. It's completely plausible that some people didn't. And I think it's a fact. There were so many people there, but there were enough people who came with a goal and who acted on it that I think goes to what you're saying about the essential characterization is these aren't just people who wandered in, tourists taking pictures. There's evidence that they were casing the venue. There's evidence of planned military structures, in the sense that if you're a crowd, there's more effective ways of breaching a barrier if you stand in a certain formation, you move in that formation, and you have coordination along that. You don't do that if it's a spontaneous thing where we just got angry and we thought we'd break some windows. And I think the one thing that is worth rewatching just to think more about this is some of the scenes where the police are trying to confront the invaders or the attackers. And I watched two clips that I want to highlight. One is the where Ashley Babbitt is shot, and so the scene you can find is pretty easy to find. And what happens there is that you can see the police who are standing guard at this door, which has glass windows. They clearly have no ability to withstand this crowd pushing on again, so they retreat, and so they leave. And in this gap of about 15 to 20 seconds between when they leave and when the tactical officers show up, you can see that the people on the other side of this door are panicked. They feel like they're going to get rushed. And you listen to what this crowd are telling the police and what they're, just the intimidation that is going through. It is really, it's infuriating to see this. And it just, there's so many things that are bad about it. So the disrespect to the police officers trying to do their job, and the fact that they're trying to de-escalate. It's not like the police officers are shouting in their faces and trying to tell them and sort of being really aggressive in response. They're being overly passive and accommodating. So that's one thing, just to rewatch that and say, how can you characterize any of this as no big deal? Like, you should not behave that way towards police in any reasonable context. Even in a protest, this is not appropriate. And then I think there are scenes on the outside that were released as part of the first hearing that need to be watched. That you can't say, oh, the news media clipped this. They made it look worse. It's bad. And you can see these are video cameras that are positioned on the building. This is not just someone who happened to be there. The idea that this was that it's a hoax, which is one thing you hear, and two, that it's something that just got out of hand. I think neither of those is plausible when you get more of the evidence of what was happening there. It's really chilling. I have to say that. Yeah. So let's talk a bit about the what led up to this and some of the experience. So the whole narrative of the investigation is Donald Trump has at least some responsibility, moral, maybe legal responsibility, and this was obviously the topic of the second impeachment, that he incited the riot. I don't think we're going to talk about the legal issue. I don't think that's something we're expert in, but I think there's definitely something to say about the moral responsibility and what he was saying, and what you can hear the crowd saying are their reasons for being outraged. And I think this is something we talked about originally, which is, if you are pounded with the story that the election was stolen from you, there's massive fraud, the country's on the brink, and this is the moment. I don't think the reasonable thing to do is to attack the Capitol, but you can understand why people are upset if they believe this. And what's come out is just the degree to which there was no basis for this, and that was known within the White House.
Yeah. So the part of what we're getting is how many people knew that these allegations that there's significant electoral fraud in various states, that there was no evidence for it. Most of the people within the White House knew that. Some even seems like they told Trump that. It's all dismissed. That's important to know, and important for anyone has some sympathy that, look, you can't have this many claims about election fraud without, they must have some evidence. That inference that they wouldn't keep saying this unless they had some evidence, that if you make that inference, part of what's coming out you should challenge that. Do I really have grounds to think that it's so many people? Yeah, we don't have evidence, but they go along in various ways with the push by Trump and probably some others, but certainly like some of his circle, like Giuliani, that, oh no, but of course there's fraud, and then in the election, and in terms of thinking about it as, is there any evidence here? I think something that what has come out, that they're just in effect reminding us of, or reiterating, that Trump claimed fraud before the election even happened. So, like, could he have evidence that there's fraud in these states and so before the election happened? And there's a long run-up where he said the only way I can lose is if there's massive fraud. And so he telegraphed that if I lose, I'm going to claim fraud, regardless of whether I have any evidence for it. I'm going to claim fraud. He was asked about the transition, of if he loses the transition, and he doesn't guarantee anything, and so it's all telegraphed in advance that this is what he's going to do. And if someone in the country is undecided, or in terms of thinking about, because I think it's natural to think you can't have all these people saying there's election fraud without, they must have some evidence and so on. You should really rethink that it's possible they had a lot of voices claiming this on zero evidence, and they knew they have zero evidence. And I think that, in terms of understanding what happened, that's important in terms of processing this whole thing. And we talked a lot about in the first podcast we did just after the January 6th, of this issue of what evidence has been brought forth about election fraud, and it's essentially zero. On the scale that's being alleged, it's essentially zero.
I want to talk more about that, but we've gotten a question so far. Thanks to all of you watching and who are supporting us through Super Chat. We appreciate your being here and your support. So one question has come up is there reason to expect, or any chance that what's coming out in these hearings will convince anyone to change their position on the incident? And the person asking the question says he's skeptical because of widespread tribalism. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, we do live in a tribal age, so yes, it's not going to sway that many people, I think. And part of what we talked about, some of the valid criticisms of the whole process, makes it such, precisely because there are some valid criticisms of it, makes it even less likely that it's going to have a persuasive impact on a lot of people. But on the other hand, you have to think of it at the margins. So, and there's a lot of people who are just independent. They don't side and don't think of themselves as I'm Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. They're more independent, and it's in a certain way you can think of like that's the audience, and that you should understand what happened on January 6th. And there, I do think someone who's hasn't descended so far into the tribalism will, if they actually listen, will learn some things and may change their mind, or may just form a stronger view than they had before of certain positions. And that's an important thing to happen, I think.
So I wanted to talk a bit about one of the main lines that the hearings have brought forward, which is that what should the president do in a situation like this, and what did Trump actually do, and what is the evidence about this? So for people who don't remember, there was really nothing coming out of the White House while this was happening. And afterwards, I think it was the day after or very shortly afterwards, Trump released a video. I forget exactly. It was about a minute and a half long. And this is him saying,
the day of. This
Oh, it
was
was
the
the day
day
of.
of,
Okay,
but
so,
hours into the
right.
attack.
So not at a time when it might have actually had some impact, I guess, but not as soon as it could have been. And the gist of that, and people could go find it, is it's very sympathetic to the people who attacked the Capitol. It treats them as rightly as, I understand why you're hurt and you're good people, but we have to have peace. So you need to go home. But we were wronged, but you still have to go home. We need to have peace. So it's not the kind of statement that I would have expected the commander in chief to issue when one of the branches of government is being attacked in this way. I just want to get your reactions to what has come out on this topic.
I think this is if not the most important issue for the committee to investigate and provide findings on. If not the most important, then it's top three. What we saw from the outward public face during January 6th is Trump missing in action. And again, if you want to liken it to something where somewhat similar, the 9/11, I mean, I certainly remember this. I bet you remember it. There's footage of where I think he's in a elementary school classroom or something, and the official comes and tells him there's been we now think it's an attack on the World Trade Center, and his face changes completely, and he's rushed out of the room. But then, for hours and hours and hours, we did not hear from the president, who's the commander in chief. Now, and that just caused real worry and heightened the fear, I think, in the country. It's the story, what turns out, but the point is, you didn't know this at the time, but you found this out later, that they didn't know the scale of the attack during 9/11. They didn't know if the president is under attack. He's commander in chief, so he was put secluded. I think he was up in Air Force One circling or something, and it's not a time that he's going to make a public address, because they're trying to figure out the scale of the attack and what's happening. And is the president? I mean, the Pentagon was targeted, Congress was targeted. Is the president also targeted? So there was a legitimacy that he was missing in action. But if you found out that not just publicly he's missing in action, but behind the scenes he's also doing nothing, that 9/11 happens, they rush him out, and then he's just watching it on TV or something, not talking to the generals, not doing anything as commander in chief, you would have a very different view of George Bush on the day of 9/11. I mean, that's not what it didn't turn out, that he's just watching it on TV, not doing anything. But what is coming out, it seems like that's what Trump did. You've got an attack on in Washington on the Capitol. I don't think there's any allegations to think Trump's life is in danger. There might be an attack on him or something like that. And what the testimony so far is that he did absolutely nothing for hours. And if that does not disqualify you to be commander in chief of the United States Army, what would? And this is why I think it's so important. If that's true, and so far there's nobody who's contesting that that's true, that is such a damnation of what happened on January 6th. That I think this is one of the most important to what happened behind the scenes. It's clearly publicly he did nothing, but is it also that privately, at qua commander in chief, he did nothing, or there's even allegations he did worse than nothing?
When we were talking about, in preparation for today, we were talking about the attitude some people have taken towards Mike Pence. And so in comparison, Mike Pence did at least two things we now know. Publicly, we know he refused to go along with the demands from President Trump to withhold the certification process and stop it. And he refused to do that. So it went through, and so we know that. And a lot of people look up to Pence and say, good, I mean, I'm glad you did that. So that's one reaction people have had since then. But now it's coming to light that it was Mike Pence who called, I think it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, saying, what can we do here? We need to do something. And this has now elevated Mike Pence in some people's view to, well, now here's one hero in our midst. And you made the point that I thought was really interesting, which is, and credit to him for doing that. I mean, I think that's a reasonable thing to do. But how do you think of this in terms of the evaluation here?
Yes, I think it is important to say this was good on his part to do this. Likely, it's also they heard that there's chance of hanging Mike Pence, so I can understand why he's on the phone calling to send somebody now. We need reinforcement and backup. But more broadly, I think he legitimately thought the Capitol is under attack, and this can't stand in America. And it can't be that, we deliberate for a week about is this legitimate or not. And you need action, immediate action in regard to this. That's good on his part, and as not caving in to try to interfere with the whole process of the election. In my books, it doesn't make him a hero unless he repudiated his past actions, in the sense that you're part of the administration whose head has been saying for months that if I lose, it only can be because of fraud. So there's no other way I could lose. And you're a participant in that. So I have some respect for what he did. It doesn't make him a hero in my book. I'd have more respect if there was a complete repudiation of Trump and some of Pence's role in that, of enabling Trump. Then I would have a more favorable view of Pence than I do. But it's certainly good. I mean, it's what he did on January 6th, and it's certainly good in comparison to Trump.
Yeah, but that's the worry, right? If you start with a low standard, that is going to make Pence look like a giant. But the standard has to be higher than just what I think Trump's dereliction was, or his lack of action, according to the evidence so far. Let's talk about one other thread here, which I think is really significant. We talked about this originally right after the attack itself, and I think we went on in depth on this topic. This is the issue of the arbitrary and how objectivism thinks of this category in contrast to claims that are true, claims that are false. And I recommend, we're going to talk a bit about it here, but you can re-listen to that conversation we had in January 2021 if you want to get more in depth on it. But just, I think it's worth putting this on the table, because what comes through in the hearings and what they presented about what Trump was told and the kind of pushback he got to the claims that elections were stolen, there was fraud, all these claims that he's made, and the various theories and conspiracy thinking type claims, that this is the point we made originally. The way to think of this is that these are arbitrary claims. It's not that they're born of evidence and the evidence just isn't strong enough to support them. It's just that they're born of no evidence and in defiance of the need for evidence. And as soon as you knock down one, there's another one that comes along. And again, it too is in the same category. So maybe it'd be useful, Onkar, you teach about this in your courses. What is, just as a framework, what is the objectivist view of the arbitrary as a category? And how do you see it coming out in this context? And what lessons do you take from it?
In various ways, the Trump administration in general, I think, is a textbook example of what the arbitrary is and how destructive it is. But if we narrow it now to the aspect that's really manifest in January 6th and lead up and aftermath of January 6th, it's in the claims of election fraud. So the arbitrary is a claim, an idea, a proposition. It can sometimes be a whole theory put forth that's devoid of evidence. There's no actual evidence and reasoning and arguments in support of the idea or the claim. And yet you're supposed to take the claim seriously nevertheless, that either just accept it as true or accept it at least Like, it's possible that this happened, so we need to investigate this, think about it. So the arbitrary is a claim put forth without evidence and really in defiance of the need for evidence. I can just, whatever I feel, whatever pops into my mind, I can treat as it's true or probable or possible. I can toss it out, and then everyone has to consider it and then think, is it possible? Is it probable? Should we regard this as true? The moment you allow that into this is how what the quest for knowledge looks like, you destroy the quest for knowledge. And that part of what came out, I mean, there were certainly things we knew before this, but you can put it, what the hearing so far has reinforced is that the claims put forth about election fraud, and here it's particularly the claims put forth by the administration, so by Trump, by Giuliani, that's not, there might be somebody somewhere who has some evidence that in some one voting place something went wrong, but that's not the same. Does Trump have any evidence? What is clear, I think, if it wasn't clear before, is he has no evidence. Giuliani has no evidence. There's no evidence put forth. It's all arbitrary. I can imagine something like this happening. Prove it ain't so. Or the fraudulent presentation of something as evidence. So some little clip about, look, this guy's carrying a suitcase. How can that happen? This is not proper. And if you watch, I mean, and this is part of what, if you watch the whole thing, no, this is the regular activity within when they're counting votes and so on. It's not evidence of any fraud, and there was never any reason to think of it as evidence. It's just the arbitrary assertion. Look what happened here. Isn't that some evidence? Prove it ain't so. And the moment you allow that someone can put forth, and it's now your obligation to prove it ain't so, it's endless. You will never, and it's more, you will never knock down the idea that there was fraud, because, and this is what happened. It seems to what happened. Like, this is how our government was functioning. Arbitrary assertion after arbitrary assertion of fraud, and then there would have to be actual people in the government, in the Justice Department, investigate this and prove this ain't so. And then every time the reply is, okay, what about this? And they put forth some other arbitrary, and I mean, it's concocted into Venezuela's involved, the voting machines, and if you allow that in, you cannot put a stop to it. So objectivism's, what its advice about the arbitrary is, the moment you have an arbitrary claim, you have to bar it at the door of consideration. It has no standing in a quest for knowledge. You have to say no to it, not start to entertain it, try to prove that it ain't so and so. Once you do that, you've wrecked your whole process of seeking knowledge. And that sounds like what happened in regard to all these investigations. And so part of what you're getting is they put forth something, it gets knocked down, and they just make up another arbitrary thing. And then, so you can cling forever to the idea that there was election fraud if you allow that I can hold ideas that are arbitrary. That is, that for which I have no evidence. I just feel and I want it to be so. And why couldn't it be? And prove it ain't so. It's so destructive. And part of what you see is that that's really what was happening in the lead up to the election, and certainly in the aftermath.
When we talked about this at the time, I don't remember if this came out at the time, but I remember since then, I re-listened to the recorded phone interview between Trump and the Georgia election officials, which I think we talked about previously. And one interesting thing is, so this is Trump. I don't think he knew he was being recorded. So this was not I don't think he was putting on a show for anyone. This is just Trump unfiltered, the way he speaks with other officials. To your point about how as soon as you let this in, you can't ever satisfy. There's never a way to block the arbitrary once you concede its legitimacy. And in the conversation, he keeps insisting that there's fraud. And the officials from Georgia keep reminding him that, well, we looked at this and that wasn't what you thought it was. When we looked at that thing and it wasn't what you thought it was. But what you get from listening to the recording is he wants it to be true. So it has to be true. So it's sort of like my wish has to make the facts the case. So go find me the facts. Go satisfy yourselves. But I'm satisfied. I don't need the evidence. How could this be? I mean, you're just giving me obstacles. I want you to give me solutions. And the solutions is, yes, make my wish a reality. And it's really striking. And they're being super polite. They're not even confrontational with him, because I don't think they have the sense of what to do. But it's interesting how a few of them, I think one of them, Raffensperger, is the one who says, look, we can't give you certain things because there's legal protections for some of this data, and you can't just go and overrule that. But just the hearing someone behave on this premise in a unfiltered way is really illuminating, because you get the sense it's my desire for some claim to be true is all that's needed. And now, if you don't buy that, that's your problem, not my problem. So for people who are interested in getting a flavor of that, definitely go find that. I think it's easily found recording. We can put recording links to the recording if people want to find it in the show notes.
And this is just
so
putting it
go ahead.
a little more, not a little more, but putting it in terms that Ayn Rand often talks about. She talks about dictators and would-be dictators as they want their whims to be able to supersede the facts. And the assertion of the arbitrary is that issue in regard to knowledge, that my feelings and whims about what I want to be true is, look, it trumps your arguments, it trumps the facts, it trumps the evidence. I couldn't care less about that. It's my whims should govern what is true and what we claim as true. And that's why it's so destructive, that when you allow the arbitrary in, you allow into a process or a quest for knowledge whims. And as in any other area, if you allow whims in, all you're going to reach is destruction.
We've gotten quite a few questions, and I'd like to make time for some of them. Let's turn to another topic, which I think is important, and that is some of the reactions, or the cultural reactions, to the hearings and the subject of the hearing. So one issue is the criticisms of the hearings. We talked earlier about some either valid or plausibly valid criticisms one might have of the hearings. I want to talk about some other kinds of criticisms that have come up. One we touched on already, which is that from the moment after the event, I think, or soon after it, I've heard people actively playing down what happened. So this is the claim that it was a political protest that got out of hand, or that this was in one person who many years ago I used to respect as an intellectual, but I can't actually respect him anymore. Roger Kimball, he's really prominent in certain conservative circles. He has made the claim that this is all a hoax, and take seriously, he means it as a hoax. This is all drummed up. And that to me is, and so if your view is that this is all exaggerated, then your view of the hearings have to be, well, this is nonsense. And one of the characterizations that have come out so far, and this is something that Tucker Carlson, who has a really big show on Fox, the way he's characterized it, and you can hear it echoed in other media and by politicians, is calling this a show trial, with all of the connotations that activates about the way the Soviets conducted themselves. I think to call it a show, even if you think there are problems with the objectivity of the way they're conducting this hearing, it is nothing like a show trial. I mean, to call this a show trial is to demean, not to demean, but to reduce the severity of what the show trials were really like and how bad they were, by in effect likening them to this. So that, I think, is really unjust to what's happening, and not at all, in my view, a legitimate complaint about the hearings. I'm curious if you've seen other kinds of things along these lines.
I watched at least a lengthy segment from the Tucker Carlson show that was airing at the time of the first primetime hearing or session of the two sessions that have been held so far. I think it is worth talking a little bit further about the Tucker Carlson, because he, as you said, he's widely watched. I think he's the most widely watched commentator on TV. The spin that he's putting on it is the spin then that many, many people are going to be prone to. It's very revealing, the spin that he's putting on it. One of the most revealing things, when I heard this, I didn't quite believe it, that the Fox News decided not to air this hearing in prime time because it's showtime, or at least propaganda on the part of the Democrats, and we don't air propaganda from Democrats. Okay, so that already, that this is supposedly a news network and they're not showing this. You could have then commentary afterwards pointing out what you think is all the elements that are propaganda and so on. That they don't show it at all. And then during his show, they didn't have commercials. So he's telling them this is all, it's like a show trial, it's propaganda, while simultaneously being worried that if viewers during a commercial click over to it, what you'll see is what you said, that whatever your criticisms of it, this is not a show trial, it's not propaganda. I'm actually learning things I didn't know about January 6th. And they might keep watching and not change the channel back to Fox News. And they know that. That's why they're not showing, not just they're not showing the trial. That's one, I mean, the hearings, that's one thing. Not airing commercials is so revealing and so insulting towards their audience, that you're so stupid that even I've told you this is propaganda and a show trial, you'll click over and then watch it because, oh no, this doesn't seem like it, like a show trial. It's such contempt for their audience that that's part of why I don't think Tucker Carlson respects his audience, just as I don't think Trump respects the people he supposedly said the middle of the country who's overlooked. I don't think he ever goes there. I don't think he has any respect for those people. He doesn't have any interest in those people. I think of that in terms of Fox News as well. But this level of contempt for their audience, when I first heard it, really, they didn't show commercials. And then some of what Carlson says in there is, it's one of his criticisms, and I wrote this down, I think it's word for word, but it's pretty close, is, yeah, this is like propaganda or show trial, and the people doing it should be ashamed of themselves. But more than that, and this is the quote, as I say, it might not be word for word, but it's close. They're complicit, or they have complicity in a campaign to fool the public. That's his criticism of it. Now, if he doesn't think Trump has complicity in a campaign to fool the public over months and months and months, that the election is a fraud, and he's saying it even before the election happens, and that you can say this with a straight face, this is your criticism of them, that they're complicit in trying to fool the public, and part of the hearing is about how Trump has done this for months and months and months, despite being told by so many people that there's no evidence for anything. And that's his criticism of it. Is this a person who has any interest in the truth? I think the answer is no to that. I mean, and it's that then thinking that he has such a big audience and he doesn't have any interest in the truth, and he basically telegraphs that he doesn't have interest in the truth. That in terms of thinking more widely about the America today and our culture, so that is interesting and something to pay attention. It's part of why I wanted to see what he has to actually say about this, because so many people are listening to him and don't seem to be able to say, oh yeah, but that's all BS.
Well, let's turn to that. Let's talk a bit about beyond, including Tucker Carlson, but beyond that, just what the hearings and the wider issues, what they can tell us about the state of our culture. I think a number of things that have come up already. We've touched on some of this. One thing I wanted to single out is something I mentioned earlier when we were talking about who was selected to be part of the investigation. And the point I was raising is that I can believe that there are better people among the Republicans who wouldn't want their name put forward or wouldn't even want to participate because Donald Trump remains such an influence within the party, and that this would be the end of their political career if they which is what I think a lot of people think is the case with Liz Cheney. Like this may well be that she's not going to be part of the Republican Party anymore. They're going to drum her out. And to me, the fact that Trump has this kind of power over the Republican Party, it's more than just a former president who's waiting for his next chance to be reelected. I think there's something really unhealthy about this kind of influence, given everything that has come out that you didn't need an investigation to see, the things that you can look back and say, think about the handling of COVID, think about everything that happened before COVID, and that just the person as a president and how he was conducting himself, and then add on top of this what you know already about the events of January 6th and subsequently, that he is still part of the GOP, that they're afraid of him to such a degree, and that they're scurrying to get his endorsement. To me, that's really frightening. It means I never had a high opinion of the GOP since paying attention to this the last 20 years or so. I never thought they were a party of ideas that is somehow compromising on. I don't think they had ideas to begin with for the last few decades, maybe longer. But this is the point at which there's not any concern with ideas or principles. We have a certain leader, and even though he's not in power, we're really afraid of what he might say to us. His influence is so considerable. It's really damning of the party itself, in my view, as an intellectual political phenomenon. And I think that when you look at this, it's I'm trying to remember this politician's name, but I can't. It's not coming back to me. But and I hope I get the facts straight. Someone can correct us in the chat if not. There was a politician who was critical of Trump in the last 2 years or so, and she was coming up for re-election. This happened recently, and she realized that unless she makes amends with him, there's no chance for her to succeed. And it's just low-level, state-level type of politician, if I remember correctly. So she went outside of Trump Tower in New York City, and I think she live streamed or at least videotaped herself speaking a monologue to Trump, because I don't think he can hear her from up wherever he lives on that building, but effectively saying, "Forgive me, I have sinned against you. I'm here to repent and to win back your support." And she got it. So she abased herself. I mean, think about, I'm not accidentally using religious terms. I think there's really a religious aspect to this, which is we have an authority figure. He's really powerful. Dare not cross him. And if you do cross him, you have to make sure you go back and try to win his favor. And to me, this is not a political party. I mean, it reminds me a bit of what I think the mafia looks like. It reminds me of how religions operate. This is not what you would expect of a political phenomenon, political movement, to the extent the Republicans are such a thing. So I find that really disturbing for the state of political scene. I'm just interested in your reactions more broadly about the impact on, or what can be said about the culture from this.
Yes, it's what you brought up is part of what I find disturbing. I wrote right after Trump's election of part of what I thought about the meaning of his election was, and part of what was frightening was the kind of campaign that he ran, and that he seemed to have significant enthusiastic support, not people holding their nose and I'm voting for him because I hate Hillary even more. I hate Trump, but I hate Hillary even more. It was enthusiasm about him. And then that we're seriously, in terms of the country, there's serious speculation that Trump will run again, so that the Republican Party won't bar him. Like, we don't want this as our presidential nominee. We'll do everything we can to not have somebody like this as our presidential nominee. There's not that kind of, that's part of what you were talking about in terms of the party. It's exactly the reverse. It's the abasement and the self-abasement to try to win Trump's favor. So that's the party. But more widely, just in terms of that, we're seriously debating that if he runs, he could win, that he would get enough support that he would win if he ran again as president. That I find really disturbing. And I think if you told people 10 years ago, you gave a scenario, like a president has done this, and you list some of what Trump did as president, and you brought up COVID. I mean, COVID and his reaction to it, and was a disaster, and just his the total non-scientific, anti-scientific approach, sidelining the CDC. I mean, it was a complete disaster. If you gave people a list, like, this is what this president done, and you don't tell them it's Democrat or Republican, I think a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans would say, okay, well, we're not going to vote for a president like that again. But he's never going to win re-election. And that's things before January 6th. But even if all that didn't happen, and all you had was after the election, let's say even before the election, Trump wasn't saying, oh, if I lose, it has to be fraud. Let's say the election happened, and then he starts saying there was fraud. The only reason I lost is fraud. It's massive fraud. And he's doing that for 2 months leading up to January 6th. And then you have the January 6th attack, which we've said we characterize as a terrorist attack. And you find out that he does nothing while this is happening. I think if you just gave that scenario to anyone 10 years ago, imagine a president who after an election is alleging that there's all kinds of fraud. It goes to court, like I think it's 60 plus cases go to court. They're, apart from one, they're tossed out, they're rejected. It's the Congress and Senate is going to certify this and so on. He's still alleging all kinds of fraud. And then there's an attack on the Capitol, and the president does nothing as commander in chief. And when he comes on air, like he calls about how he loves these people who have been attacking the Capitol. They should go home now because they're not going to succeed and so on, but he loves them. And you said, you don't, again, tell them Democrat, Republican. Would you vote for this? I think the majority of people would say no. There's no way in hell I would vote for someone like that. And yet we're at the stage where it appears that a lot of people would support him. I find it very depressing, unfortunately, but I think it's symptomatic of how tribal the nation has become in the last 20 plus years. And I would, just to make this more concrete, that takes seriously, he's the commander in chief. Notice all the criticism of what happened in Uvalde of the police. And the criticism is, now, I think there has to be an investigation of what really happened and so on. And there's a part of why there has to be this kind of investigation, I think, for January 6th, of is it really true that the president did nothing? All the criticism of the police commander, you're waiting outside for 45 minutes doing nothing, and everybody's reaction, like if that's really what it is, everybody's reaction is this guy should be fired. And the idea is that, oh no, we're going to appoint him a month later back to the chief of police and so on. It's like everybody thinks that's crazy. And it's basically the same scenario here. That if you have a commander in chief who does nothing when the Congress and Capitol is attacked, you should have the same reaction as if that's what happened in Uvalde with the police. That if it really turns out they were just scared, they didn't want to go in, so on, and one views that as a complete dereliction of their duty. Now, I don't know if that's really what happened, but if it is, and that's how it was being painted and people's reaction to it, you should have exactly the same reaction to Trump as commander in chief, and it just morally disbars him from the office.
Yeah, and just to re-emphasize that, we're here talking about how people evaluate Trump, not about what you should do to vote. We're not giving voting advice if he does run or anything like that. I want to add one item of information that I slipped my mind, and my colleagues reminding me that the individual I was describing who went to abase herself outside of Trump Tower, I believe that was Congresswoman Nancy Mace from South Carolina. She was running for a congressional district. And let's take a couple of questions, because I think they'd be useful just to tie up some of the threads in the conversation. So one is, how do we explain the fact that Donald Trump and his supporters expect to be allowed to get away with whatever lies they want to tell, and the person suggesting that the Christian doctrine of grace is the explanation? Do you find that that's part of the answer, or not at all? Or how do you think of that?
I don't think that's the essence of the answer. It is true that there's elements in the Christian faith that I think actually give a license to evil. It's not how it's thought of, but the whole conception of you go to a priest and confess and that absolves you of your sins and so on, that makes a mockery of sin, in my view. If you actually think you've done something wrong, to atone for that is not to go talk to a priest in privacy and then it's, oh yeah, okay, you seem repentant, so I atone, I absolve you of your sins. That is just a ridiculous conception. So there can be an element of that at work here, but I think the much broader phenomenon, like how do they think they can get away with it? Part of the descent into tribalism is nobody now thinks you have to give arguments, evidence, convince people, offer a persuasive case for anything. So you've got a similar kind of excusing and whitewashing of the BLM protest that many Democrats, if we think of it like that, just at this kind of Democrat-Republican, should have been much, much more condemnatory of elements of these protests. And certainly when you get the occupation in Seattle, the things happening in Portland, the idea that there was not outrage on the part of Democrats about what's happening, that this is a breakdown of rule of law. We need to reinstate rule of law and maybe even have some investigation. Like, how is this possible in major cities in the US? There's nothing like that on the Democrat side. And you can ask, how do they think they're going to get away with it? And we increasingly live in an era that everybody thinks they can get away with things, because you can just, so this is part of the arbitrary, you can just make assertions without the need for evidence. So you can just say, well, all the Black Lives Matter protests, they're peaceful. So what? There's nothing to see here and so on. And some were, but the idea that that's the whole phenomenon is crazy. And yet they get away with it. So I don't think it's just sort of the religious element in the Republican Party. It's more broadly, religion is tribalism. And so it's a tribal mentality and a religious mentality are difficult to distinguish. And when you think of the wars in Europe of Protestants and Catholics, the lens to look at that through is these are two tribal gangs fighting.
Just one quick thought on that, and then a final question from our viewer. So one thought I have is that what you're describing, if you look at it as separate things, it's hard to see that there's a certain dynamic going on. So it's both true that there are people, so Democrats who downplayed all and tried to whitewash the violence that we saw in places like Portland, Seattle, and some of the riots that occurred with BLM protests. But I think these interact. I think there's an interesting causal relationship, which is if you're looking at this and being told, no, the fire behind me has nothing to see here. This is not a riot. It's just peaceful protest. And they have you're deluded if you think there's anything wrong going on here. That I think that leads people to feel like, well, how can they get away with that? Why are they lying to me when I can see it's not that way? And I think the reverse is true when it's, well, we don't want to have to admit that January 6th was a shameful activity and that I shouldn't have supported this, the people behind the stories about fraud and election mismanagement and that whole narrative. And you get this, I think, the similar reaction, which is, well, if they can do it, why can't we? And the idea that it becomes, I guess this ties into your point about how once it's accepted, it's fair game. But I think there is a certain kind of reciprocal reinforcement. The more it's done, the more both sides feel like they should do it. And it's sort of, well, not exactly revenge, but just vindication that, well, what's wrong with this? But let me bring up the final question. Sorry, let me just bring up this final question because I think it's useful just to tie up. So the question begins with an observation that the validity of the vote counts was constitutionally tested in the courts, appealed to the Supreme Court, considered the majority, upheld the lower court's validation of the vote, and then once the courts have ruled, an attempt to reverse the vote by intimidation looks like a banana republic style coup d'etat. Why did you say that it wasn't? Well, I agree with part of what was said there, which is all these claims were tested and rejected, or all but one of them were significantly found to be flawed in the courts, and there wasn't evidence of mass scale fraud. I don't think it was true to say it was stolen. And I think that there were, but on the question, was it a coup d'etat? I think that there was less planning and less conception of what would follow. That's why I resist calling it a coup, in the sense that I think if you try to get into this mindset of what would it look like to do that, there would have to be a next step. Like, who then takes over, and what would that look like, and what would you enforce? Not just let's block the certification. And in that sense, I think as much as there seems to be evidence of premeditation, at least with some of the groups involved in January 6th, I don't think it rose to the level of a well-developed plan or an actionable plan for replacing the government once had they succeeded. And in that sense, I think it doesn't quite rise to a coup, even if it was an attempt to fundamentally disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. But I completely agree with the characterization that it was beneath the dignity of America to have this kind of incident. Banana Republic, if you take that as a very negative connotation, I agree with that. But I wanted to get your perspective, Onkar, on how to characterize this and how to conceptualize what happened.
I agree with what you said. Let me say something further about Banana Republic style dictatorship. We talked some about this in our original podcast after January 6th, that one shouldn't just think of dictators. If all that comes to mind is Hitler or Stalin, you're not really thinking about the whole phenomenon of dictatorship. And banana republics have real differences to something like Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, because they don't have a whole ideology often behind them. But you nevertheless have a dictator who, in effect, wields total power, but he's not wielding it totally in the way that he's trying to reform all of society in the way that Nazi Germany, say, is doing. But it's still a dictatorship. And one thing when you see countries descend into becoming banana republics is and thinking of it as a coup. So to go back to the aspect of the question about a coup, is it's a military coup. The military takes over. One of the crucial aspects of the American system is that the military is in civilian control. So this is part of why it's important, and I've been stressing this, that the president is the commander in chief, and it's important that he's the head of the military and not some unelected general, but also someone whose whole profession is just in the military. It's important that it's under civilian control. In terms of thinking of how we could get to the stage of a real banana republic, I think one possibility is that the military takes over. And sometimes that happens for understandable reasons, that they think you've got a crazy person who's in charge here, who's detached from reality, and we're going to take control. It doesn't work, because a military should not be the head of the government. And so, but it's sometimes understandable that the military feels we've got to take power. And you can see that happening in the US. And this is part of why I think it's that Trump, his character and conduct should disbar him from the presidency. Because, and this was part of General Milley, when the little testimony that came is, yeah, we're dealing with someone who's detached from reality. And if you imagine a real military situation where Trump is just proceeding by arbitrary thing after arbitrary thing, and the military will have a perspective of, do we just follow all these orders that are crazy, or do we not? And the not, I could see, not immediately, but on the trajectory we're on, 10, 20 years, the military saying, no, we have to dispose of the president and we have to take control. Like, we can't have a crazy person who's detached from reality. So in terms of thinking about the mechanics of how dictatorship works, in a lot of these banana republics, it's the generals and so on who are the head of it. And that is not a good situation. And it's not the American form of government. And this is why you have to take really seriously, this is what our commander-in-chief was doing. And that this can't be in America. That if it's really what is being alleged happened on January 6th, there's no way a command. It's so, put it in terms of the bar, it's so below the bar of what's acceptable for a commander-in-chief that that really should impact what people think of Trump.
Well, we're over time, and thanks to all of you who submitted questions. We tried to get some of those in. Thanks to all of you who submitted Super Chat donations. We appreciate your support, and thanks for being with us today. I want to close with some suggestions for other resources you might find interesting and useful. So we mentioned a few times the podcast that Onkar and I did in January 2021, about a week or so after the storming of the Capitol. It's a 2.5-hour analysis of what was known at the time. Highly recommend it. There's a short link there for you. We'll put it in the show notes as well. And Onkar mentioned articles that he's written about Donald Trump. One of them was written shortly after Donald Trump won the election in 2016. And that one is called One Small Step for Dictatorship. It's about the kind of campaign that Trump ran and the cultural implications of that. Highly recommend that. We'll put a link in the show notes, and there's a short link on the screen. And then the other one, which was actually solicited from us but never used, a major newspaper came to us and asked, well, what would Ayn Rand say about Donald Trump? And we don't speak for Ayn Rand, and that's one of the things you say in the article, but what would she say based on the kind of principles she articulates and our understanding of her philosophy? That's what the focus of that piece is. And the argument you make is that she would have really despised President Trump for intellectual, philosophical reasons. So highly recommend both of those. They'll be easily found on our journal, New Ideal, as well. And finally, we'll be back here with another podcast next week. That one will be on Ayn Rand's view of moral judgment. I think there's a lot of interesting things to bring out there, how distinctive her view is. So that will be led by my colleague Ben Baer on June 22nd. That's the plan. Hope you'll join us for that. And to close, we always welcome your feedback and your support of the podcast. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel. If that's where you're listening, make sure to click the bell to get notifications, like the thumbs up or whichever mechanism there is, and leave a comment. We always read the comments. And if you're watching on another platform, you have the same kind of tools. We welcome that. It helps us reach more people by doing that. And finally, we always invite your comments. You can send us suggestions, questions, ideas for topics to discuss. We read everything that comes in through this channel, newideal@aynrand.org, through email. We try to respond to as many of them as we can, and they're often the seeds of either articles or podcasts. So we welcome your feedback on what we do here in the podcast. That's all for today. Thank you for being with us. Thanks, Onkar.
Thanks, Elan. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
See you next